Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Charles Rosenbauer and Olli Payne of Possibilia magazine. Charles, Olli, welcome to the show.
Mhm.
Hi,
Thanks
thanks.
for having us. Mhm.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So, I wanted to talk to you guys because the project you're doing, I think, is something very interesting and oddly missing in our culture. So, we're in this weird space where futurism is kind of back. For a while, it felt like things were stagnant and there wasn't a lot of hype or vision or energy around looking into the future. But my sense right now, and I think a lot of other people listening would agree, is that there's suddenly been this wellspring of futuristic thinking and futuristic optimism. And a lot of that has to do with recent developments in technology, things like crypto and AI, as well as VR and other fields like that, have been making some advances, and that's probably got people excited. Um, but what's kind of missing in all of this is a real positive narrative for what the future would look like. Um, and in particular, there's a lot of dystopian narratives. There's a lot of dark narratives about the future being this very inhuman, cold, machine-like place that is largely inhospitable. But you guys are trying to do something different. So tell us a little bit about Possibilia and what you guys are trying to do.
Yeah, of course. So Possibilia is a literary magazine that Charles and I actually had. So it was very much like Charles had this idea for this sci-fi literary magazine. I had this idea for this sci-fi like show. I wanted to produce a TV show,
Hmm.
and we happened to meet. I think Charles, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of us saw the other on Twitter and like
It
DM.
was back when we're both Palladium subscribers. Back when
Right.
Palladium ran salon like these salon video calls
Hmm.
for subscribers. We The subject of sci-fi as a social technology came up in one of those conversations, and we were both on that call, and we wound up talking a bit afterwards.
That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
So we had both identified this lack of optimism, and were basically both wanting to solve the problem via sci-fi and via storytelling. It's very the the vibe of sci-fi for the past 10 years or so has been, like you said, very dystopian. And I feel like that's been reflected in society as well. I think a lot of people have lost faith in technology. They don't trust social media platforms or the people who run them anymore. They don't trust the people who work in tech. And a lot of that has come out through media as well. But we wanted to show basically a more optimistic perspective on what we can do with technology and what we can do with human agency. And then Charles, I'm sure you have some to say on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I like to use this term mimetic infrastructure.
Hmm.
Like there is, people generally don't build their houses very far from the road, and ideas I think work in a very similar way, right? Um, if if you think about, like, the space of possible ideas, it gets very, very large very quickly, right? A simple decision tree of yes or no decisions grows exponentially, and so you don't have to go very far down the decision tree before it's just completely infeasible to search everything there. And so in general, you need some other way to kind of simplify the problem and to find solutions to problems more quickly. And so, people, you need some kind of like scaffolding of uh, of ideas that are known to work well. And so, there's there's this kind of infrastructure. Yeah, I think of ideas a lot of as like a kind of infrastructure of like, you're if you have some type of popular idea, it's a lot easier to develop new ideas that are very close to that idea, or like simple remixes of that idea and some other very popular idea, right? Whereas
Hmm.
if you have something that's a bit further off the beaten track, if you have something that is even if it's a very interesting, very promising idea, but it's not very well known, that's much harder to get people to kind of imagine what a future looks like with that, right?
Yeah. So, what do you think is the hang up then about producing optimistic sci-fi? Why does it always go in this dystopian direction?
So I think it's a lot easier to write dystopian fiction. Think it's a lot easier with optimistic, and especially since we are going for optimistic and realistic,
Hmm.
it actually has the writer go through a world building activity that could be applied as like a plan for the world to build an actual positive future. And this type of thing is like very hard to construct. It's really hard to get it right. That's why we haven't gotten it right in reality yet,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, it's I think one thing that has is definitely coming up a bit is there is there are people who are good at writing, and then there's people who are good at the technical side, and
Yeah.
then you know, there's not necessarily always a huge amount of overlap. We are, with the magazine, we are doing this thing with these, for each story that we publish, we have a nonfiction companion piece of like the science behind the fiction, basically,
Hmm.
and so, we're trying to use that to kind of bridge the gap a little bit, but we are also, we do a fair bit of workshopping with the writers we have, and so there's a lot of kind of back and forth of like, me pointing out, hey, this idea isn't exactly realistic, and like, and so sometimes it gets into some interesting, some like very interesting conversations around like, oh, or sometimes it'll be like hey, we like this is like an interesting kind of idea, and but like there, like here's like some like esoteric like data science technology or something that would actually be like very involved, that would make sense to be involved in this. And like, can we just like is there some way that we can like take a few ideas from that and like have that constrain it? And just as an example, and like, does that constrain the story in like an interesting way? I think in many cases there's a lot of people who are um the incorporating like less realistic, more fantastical elements can, make the stories easier to tell
Hmm.
and make it easier to write stories. But I think in many cases, I think artists are generally fairly well aware that there's a lot of creativity that from constraints. And so if you have the constraint that like, no, actually this has to be realistic, and you have to account for like this really strange esoteric technical aspect, I think that can create more interesting stories if it's done right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think what I'm hearing is like a large part of the problem is just like if you want to produce realistic, optimistic sci-fi, if you want to actually construct a vision of the world that's different in a reachable way from where we are now, and is also uh and it's also like an improvement on our current situation,
Mhm,
then the amount of constraints that you're piling on just raises the difficulty level of doing that tremendously.
mhm.
Is that what I'm
I
hearing?
Yeah, yeah, and I think also, there's another aspect of it, which is that, you can, for example, if you can find like stuff that people wrote about like predictions for the future from like 100 years ago, right? Like there and like one thing that you see surprisingly often is you'll see people talk about like predictions about things that sound like smartphones and things, right? And I think in many ways, there's a certain set of ideas about what the tools that we have as a society are, um, and how we can use those tools, and how we can solve certain problems with those tools. And every so often, what happens is it doesn't really matter how good your tools are. eventually all that you're going to be left with are the problems that your tools aren't capable of solving, right? And so, um, and so, if you can have some like very powerful set of tools, that gets you so far, and then eventually the number of problems that those tools don't solve just accumulates more and more, and eventually you need a new toolbox, right? And I think one of the deeper problems, and I think it's going to be a while before we really flesh out exactly what this looks like, but we do have we have talked about some ideas in this kind of direction. But I think there are a lot of interesting ideas that are like very esoteric that are not getting very much attention that I think are if you think about like the what are the implications of like this kind of technology and like project it forward. um I think in many cases there are some like you can have some like very counterintuitive or like new tools that people can have. And you know it might part of what might be going on here is that we've kind of run out of ideas. We're like we have this toolbox of like here are all of these things that we're familiar with, and what kinds of problems we can solve with them. And this toolbox is actually a lot older than we realize, and we've kind of run out of ideas on or we're running short on like new ideas of what we can do with them. And so might need to start putting some effort into building a new toolbox of like, okay, what are some new ideas, what are some new technologies and stuff, and what are some new you know counterintuitive original ideas about what kind of a future can we build with those kinds of tools?
Mm.
So,
And in
yeah.
terms of the narrative construction then around the technological possibilities, how does that work? Is there a process you have for getting the writers to fit into what you're trying to create? Um, is there a lot of like, is there a lot of back and forth,
Mhm.
or is it more like, you have some writers, they're largely already trying to do the thing that you are looking to do, and they were just sort of looking for a home for this kind of story?
So it's a bit of a this one is a bit of a mix. We have a couple of writers who were already really excited, or were really excited upon hearing about what we were doing to write optimistic, realistic sci-fi. And then we have others who thought the project was really cool and wanted to contribute. We have some people who just send in like full, complete stories into our submissions inbox. But for the most part, we do, like Charles said, work pretty closely with writers. I We kind of divide the responsibilities, as or have in the past divided responsibilities up between Charles and I, where Charles makes sure that things stay on track on the realistic line, and I make sure that things stay on track on the optimistic line.
Mm.
Um, and at some point, we should cover like what is optimistic, because that's a whole thing. Um, we have a short answer for now, but we'll get to that at some point, I assume. Um, but it's been a very experimental process working with these different writers. They all work pretty differently. They all respond to the ideas that we come to them with pretty differently. But we do have and have been building up a writer's resource document, which Charles has mostly written and has put many, many hours into. And it's
I
uh,
I I need to go back and, it's been a while since I've touched that document, so I need to kinda go back and work on it a bit more, but
But before we even started having people write for us, Charles and I had many conversations about lots of things that we wanted to see written about, different what we think of as like neglected technologies that we see having a place in the future,
Mhm.
technologies that maybe have been like people have stopped using as much or that have been abandoned, especially that we see in things like retro future type
Mm.
fiction.
Mhm.
Um, and so we have this whole backlog of things that we would like to see, and we share that with writers, and then sometimes writers come up with ideas, completely on their own, and then we advise them towards towards optimistic, realistic as we go. And usually we'll have calls with writers, it's like Zoom calls, Google Meets calls once every week or two, just to go through what the progress has been, answer any questions, and like talk through the topic with them.
Mm.
Mhm.
And what kind of, things have been neglected or forgotten in the past? Because, futurism as a trend in culture sort of has this periodicity to it. Like it comes and goes, uh, as far as this cultural cachet and people's focus on it. And so I'm sure there are phenomena, trends, concepts from prior generations that have been forgotten about, that are part of this revival list, not just new things that weren't possible until recently.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, one technology I think is particularly interesting is stuff like sensory substitution and sensory augmentation, where the brain is actually extremely general purpose. Um, if you look at the cortex in the brain, normally we have this idea that there's like all these different regions that are dedicated to specific things, but actually, if you look at them under a microscope, they all look almost exactly the same. You have the same 6 to 12 layers depending on how you're counting, and they're all
Mm,
connected. The layers are all connected in the same way. It's basically just like the way that evolution adds more functionality to the brain is it just copy and pastes the exact same circuit over and over, and then just gives it different inputs and outputs. Um, but one of the implications of that is that the brain is actually much more malleable, and you can kind of just stream in any type of structured information into any sensory domain, and the brain can figure it out, right? And so, this is, in many ways, this is like, like a fairly fringe idea, and also that like people don't take too seriously. On the other hand, it's also like, this is basically the same technology behind writing, right? Of like, we can take something that's normally communicated through spoken word, through sound, and we can convert it into symbols on a page, and we can write it down, and that gives us a very different set of trade-offs in terms of how that information can be conveyed, uh, and how we can reason about that information, and how we can structure that information. There's things that you can practically do with with things that are written on a page that are much more harder to do if you're trying to track everything in a conversation or something. And it's also been noted that like the brain actually restructures itself quite substantially with literacy. Um, and there's a lot of there's even like fairly simple things like if you have two images that are mirror images of each other,
mm,
you know the brain actually gets dramatically better at telling those apart once you learn to read. Um, mm, and and I think in general, like there's a lot of talk today about AI and stuff. And I'm very critical of a lot of those types of conversations. I think generally I would say a lot of stuff that people think about AI today is completely incompatible with a lot of what's known about complexity theory. And there's a lot of, for example, cryptographic constraints on intelligence that I think the end result is that these kinds of things that intelligence algorithms play by very different rules from what people are expecting. For example, you have this phenomena that the entire field of cryptography is built around, which is that even a very small amount of private knowledge gives you an exponential advantage over general purpose compute, right?
mm,
There are problems that it's very easy to find cryptographic problems where like you could have a computer the size of a red blood cell that is just extremely slow, but it can compute a cryptographic function with a private key that it has. And meanwhile, you could have a computer the size of a galaxy, converting converting the energy of like a billion suns into computation, and it would be slower for that galaxy-sized computer to solve the same problem
Yeah, and
if
so
it doesn't have that private information, right?
that's an
And
interesting, like, game
mhm,
theory implication because,
mhm,
like, human brains are designed to be social, right?
yeah,
And part of social games is hidden information,
mhm,
um,
yeah,
we all have from each other.
mhm,
And so it's not just a matter of sheer brute force
mhm,
computation, which is sort of a lot of the methods of
mhm,
even the state of the art ML right now is just sort of like more data, more compute, you
yeah.
know, just keep going.
$7
Like,
trillion worth. Yeah, I mean, one of the other things I'm doing on the side is like I'm like modern CPUs are not very efficient, and so I have another venture I'm working on building CPUs that are hopefully going to be a couple orders of magnitude more efficient than most of than the one that's in your laptop right now. And it's yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we are kind of getting like computer science is a fairly young field, and I think um granted it's been around for almost a century now, but I think the way that it's going to look in a couple of century in another century may be very, very different from today. I think there's a lot of kind of interesting ideas in there if you know where to look. That I think down the way that people you know the way that the software industry, the hardware industry look today, I think is very, very different from what people are expecting they're going to look like in the future.
so
Um,
what are some like concrete, uh, like sort of adjacency things that,
mhm,
um, are reasonable within the bounds of what we know about right now, but that we might see in the near future or the medium term if people put some more thought and some more effort into it.
mhm. Um, so kind of where I was going with the sensory substitution stuff is, there's a lot of thought that people put into around like neural implants and brain implants and brain computer interfaces and stuff, and actually a very large amount of I think there's a very large amount of room for other sensory domains to be, or for like just streaming information in through a variety of different sensory domains, and the brain is capable of just like picking those details out. Um and you know and it's I think there's a lot more about how the brain works that we really don't understand very well, and I think there's a lot of room for like I think I think the mentats in Dune are actually like fairly realistic, if not like an underestimate of like what the human brain is actually capable of. I think there's a very large amount that could be done in that direction. I think that is something where I think I think we should be developing more ideas around that. I think we have some kind of I have some rough ideas around what that might look like. I think that's something that needs to be developed out a lot more. We haven't published anything kind of in that direction yet, but
Mm.
another, a different technology I think that is also worth pointing out would be space infrastructure, right? Like when people talk about space and space colonization, it it's like people are talking about colonizing some new continent using without ever building roads, right? And it's just, oh, we're gonna drive like these extremely inefficient all-terrain vehicles everywhere, right? Like, no, no, you're not gonna do that. You're gonna build roads. You're gonna build tunnels through mountains and stuff. And you're gonna have ships going up and down rivers, right? And so there's like space infrastructure ideas around things like momentum exchange tethers and Aldrin cyclers that kind of let you cheat the rocket equation, and instead people just focus instead and like that's a very big deal if you can use it. But instead people seem to kind of just focus on how do we cheat the rocket equation with like extremely speculative technologies, or things that are just like very oh, we're just gonna like have we're gonna just like hand wave some like
Yeah.
crazy warp drive or something, because otherwise it's too hard. And like, no, actually, like, there's a lot of really practical stuff that you could do here with
Mhm.
like okay, you can just build like a momentum exchange tether, or you can use an Aldrin cycler or something.
What's
And
an
it's like
Aldrin cycler?
so an Aldrin cycler is the basic idea is that you just have and like it's called the Aldrin cycler because this was actually proposed by Buzz Aldrin, and it was actually I believe it was like there was some conversation being had at NASA about how do we make a Mars mission how do we make like frequent missions to Mars palatable to Congress. And Buzz Aldrin proposed like, okay, what we do is we have like some space station that's on like this very regular orbit that
Mhm.
regularly takes it back and forth between Earth and Mars. And so um you can kind of just like schedule and you can even have like a few different ships in like different locations in this kind of regular orbit. Um but you can set this up where it's just like some basic infrastructure where you just kind of like fly out to this one kind of station and it's on like this regular orbit and it's not really meant to like land or to like land or take off from a planet. It just stays in space the whole time, but it is like it's a space station that kind of alternates that has this orbit that brings it back and forth between like Earth and Mars or any two other destinations, and you can use that as like a way of it's almost like a space shipping container or something of like there's a large you can just if you have something like that a lot of types of missions just get a lot more practical because you have this
Yeah.
infrastructure that you can lean on.
It's like a space shuttle, like literally a shuttle
Yeah,
that
yeah,
just gets
Yeah,
passed
yeah.
back and forth.
yeah. And then like momentum exchange tethers, the idea
Mhm.
is like you can it's very hard to do any type of, like, electrical propulsion or anything in space, and so you
Mhm.
kind of always need fuel, and then you're always, limited by the rocket equation there.
Yeah.
And so, it's very hard to have a situation where your rocket isn't just, like, 90% fuel. But what you can do is you can have things like you could basically have just, like, a big rotating tether in space, and if you can latch onto some incoming spacecraft, you can absorb some of its energy. You can have like a generator on like a count on like a heavy counterweight or something, uh, and you can there's a very large number of different tricks that you can use with this, but like
Yeah. So you could sort
it's a
of slingshot
yeah.
yourself around
Yeah,
basically. Like
yeah, and you can reabsorb that energy that you used that you got from a rocket and or that you got from a previous momentum exchange tether and just
mm,
store that in some batteries or some other type of energy storage and then reuse that later. And so you can save a very large amount of energy and that makes a lot of very complicated things a lot easier in space. Um and I think it's a very there's a very large number of different things that you could do with that. I think it's a very flexible tool, and I don't think there's nearly enough sci-fi that really explores those kinds of ideas like that. And I think with with stuff like SpaceX's Starship, that's going to be by the end of the decade, you're going to be able to put like 150 to 200 tons of cargo into orbit for a couple $1,000,000,
mhm.
right? Um, I've been saying like it's like there's going to be conversations within like a decade or so about how many skid steers can you put on the moon per VC funding round, right? Um, like it's going to get very very cheap to do space stuff, and I think giving the people who are thinking about those space startups uh better ideas about here's what kind of space infrastructure you could build to like get the most bang for your buck and like really do some really serious stuff on like smaller budgets than like sci-fi would tell you would and like a lot of people would generally expect. I think if you build the right infrastructure, I think a lot of very very fascinating stuff in space is going to get a lot more practical than people think.
Yeah. And Ollie, I think you had some ideas as well for things that are kind of adjacent and that we might be moving towards.
Oh, so this was way back more on the neglected or forgotten technologies thread.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Let's go
but
back to
what
that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so very quickly, there is another piece of potential space infrastructure that I haven't seen many people talk about and that maybe they're not thinking about. Um, And this is something that I recently started thinking about because I'm working on a project with others who are also thinking about it. But Mars just has a different magnetic field than Earth. And it's pretty likely that that affects biological development. I say pretty likely because there have been experiments showing it. However, there have not been there is like some bickering in academia about whether or not those experiments and those studies are replicable. I'm actually working on a project right now that aims to replicate one of those. And so you're going to see things like yeah, this is just something that I see everyone talking about colonizing Mars. I don't see anyone talking about like how we're going to solve the magnetic field problem.
I think
And
people talk about magnetic fields with Mars in the context of radiation, but in terms of, like,
yeah,
do you need a magnetic field for, like, to bring, like, a baby to term or
right,
something?
right.
For
It's
your
like, are we
bones
all going to
to
move?
for your bones to be strong?
That's a conversation that's held
Right.
much less often. I think I've heard that conversation had a few times, but it's not given nearly enough attention, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. I think it would be bad if we all moved to Mars and became infertile. That would
Mm.
kind of suck. So the magnetic field is something that I'm hoping to see more conversation around, and we might publish a story on it soon.
Ooh, okay. All right, a little bit of a teaser to look forward to.
Indeed,
Um,
indeed.
We do have some stuff in the pipeline for the next few stories that we're
Yeah,
publishing that we're very
yeah.
excited about. So
good, good.
Oh
Well,
yeah. Seriously, very
we'll be
excited.
giving everyone the link to go subscribe at the end of this, and
Appreciate it.
people can look through those at their leisure. But so I wanted to sort of move into something that was mentioned earlier, which is this question of optimism. Because we sort of take it for granted that everybody knows what we're talking about when we say optimistic. But I have a feeling you guys mean something more particular, or at least determined. Um, and so, what is the criteria for optimistic, and what are you measuring optimistic against? Um, and it's an interesting question because, in some ways, the techno accelerationist vision in our culture would be not optimistic, depending on your perspective. Um,
Right.
so I'm interested in what your guys' understanding or vision of optimistic is.
So while we do want to like uphold optimism as a standard because it's really, really important to it's basically crucial to the goal of creating blueprints or mimetic infrastructure, like Charles said.
mhm.
Another way to look at, and one way that I look at the optimism requirement, is that it's like a really fun and positive trap. Um, for example, I have reached out to both uh, effective altruists and effective accelerationists, and I'm like,
Mhm.
challenge, write an optimistic, realistic, like a possibilia story that like contains the ethos of your movement. Not been. I think we got like an AI safety researcher submit something, and then the other day we had an anarchist submit something, and not sure of their affiliations with either group, but I think it's a I think having the optimism requirement is a really good way to trap futurists into thinking about whether their vision of the future or whether their group's vision of the future is actually optimistic. And then when people ask what we mean by optimistic, our short answer has a positive telos for humanity. And I think that most futurists are looking out for humanity, no matter which far end of the effective spectrum they may fall on, if they do fall on it at all.
Mhm.
I think at the end of the day, a lot of like all of the futurists are. It's not just the future; it's the future of humanity. So, positive telos humanity is the only like hard requirement that we have. Other than that, it's like I said, mostly a fun trap. It's meant to like cause them to think about what an optimistic future looks like if they were to build it.
I was thinking as you were speaking
Mhm.
that one of the what maybe a litmus test, a very basic litmus test would be like, am I building a future that I would want to live in?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Um, and like the positive telos for humanity is interesting because it has this humanity component is sort of central.
right.
um,
Mhm.
I would guess that some of the effective accelerationists, uh, at least the movement's own documents, seem to ally that. Um, to some of them, it's more just about like thermodynamic processes unfolding as they should. Um,
I think they're lying. I don't believe them. I
you
think they're
don't
kind
believe
of
that they really believe what they say they believe?
yeah, no, I think they're full of shit, honestly.
Good. This is a hot, spicy take.
Yeah, no, okay, so
I think it's a
I
death call, but
Yeah.
and then okay,
you just think they're liars. I don't know which is worse.
well, no, so I don't think they're consciously lying.
Mhm.
I do think that they are I think they don't hit the bar for lying, but they do hit the bar for full of shit. So I think that on the surface, they're portraying what you described, and then I think under that, maybe there's, like maybe there's some kind of a what's the word for when you're, like, standing on a balcony and you, like, get the urge to jump? There's I think there's, like, a I don't know, maybe there's a French or Latin word for it or something. I think under that, they're experiencing that feeling, and then I
Mm.
think under that, they are and, like, sorry, I don't mean to, like, psychologize them or something, but I think under that, they are, like, very worried about really bad things happening to people, and they don't know what to do about it.
Mm.
I think you know, one of the things I was getting at before with AI not being very compatible with a lot of complexity theory. This would be a long conversation, so I don't have I'm not gonna like go into a huge amount of depth on like the math or anything, but in general, there's something that you see of there's this thing in math and logic called the principle of explosion, which is
Mhm.
that when you have some kind of inconsistency, um, in something, you can exploit that inconsistency to make any argument true or false, right?
Right. Give
And
me one
that's
contradiction, and I can
yeah,
create the
yeah,
universe.
exactly. And that's in politics we call that mental gymnastics, right? And that's a very common tactic, whether people realize it or not. Whether people realize they're doing that or not. And I think in general, largely what's going on here is people have a people have a model of like what super intelligence looks like and what intelligence what these types of things look like that is not actually very accurate, and there are some inconsistencies that are coming out of that, and they are extrapolating things in a direction that just is not really very plausible. And um and then I've been comparing AI to like an overbalanced wheel lately, where it's an overbalanced wheel is this kind of mechanism that uh, looks like it should be a perpetual motion machine, right? And if you don't understand this kind of deeper, the deeper reasons why perpetual motion doesn't work, you can make all these arguments about why this overbalanced wheel should be able to spin forever, and you can engineer it where it spins for a surprisingly long time, way, way, way longer than most people's intuition would tell you. You can get these things to spin, I think, for like weeks or sometimes even months. And but and it looks like it is progress toward perpetual motion, right? And it's not. At the end of the day, it's not. You're not actually breaking any laws of physics. You're not actually disproving conservation of energy. What's really happening is you know the the space of things that can happen is just so unfathomably large and complicated that the human mind can't run through every possible scenario. And so you are using some heuristics for how you navigate that space when you're kind of when your brain is predicting what's going to happen if I do this, right?
Mhm.
And so when you and so when you come across something that is like very counterintuitive, it might look like you were breaking, or there's a large number of cases where nature is going to behave in a way that is just fundamentally very counterintuitive. Um, and I think people are running into some of those in places, on frontiers like AI, and they're misunderstanding what's going on, and they're interpreting it as like, oh, we're making like serious progress on AI, and it's we're getting closer to this like impossible thing basically. Um, and I think I yeah I think there's a lot of I think I think there's a lot of potential um for some interesting ideas about what the future looks like with AI that are very different, but are like more informed by complexity theory that can maybe bring people on a bit of a different path here.
Yeah.
So I've certainly been thinking about that a fair bit.
Well,
Um,
I
but
guess this
yeah,
this does pose the interesting question, which is how do you know that your uh, speculations about the future are actually well grounded? And I
I
guess
mean,
that's something that
if
you
you run into
guys have to
the
work on
principle
with
of
the
explosion,
artists,
you
right?
can very easily start getting very nonsensical stuff out, right? Like if you have a perpetual motion machine, you can use that to produce infinite energy, and it's not particularly hard to come up with ways of like making some kind of chain reaction or something that just pumps up more and more energy infinitely. And now, like, okay, on one hand that might sound like some extremely positive thing, and on the other hand that might sound like some extremely dangerous weapon, right? Okay, this is like an infinitely powerful weapon. Like that's not good, right? And I think people are people are coming across this kind of thing with AI, where it looks like it could either be like too good to be true, or it's like it's just too it's like infinitely good or infinitely bad. I think that's maybe it's hard to like verify, you know, clearly that like this is actually, there actually is some inconsistency here, that we actually have extrapolated this incorrectly and we've hit some nonsense. Uh but it might be hard to show that clearly, but if you are hitting this kind of extreme scenario, or extreme outcome with the extrapolations of a technology, I think that's usually an indicator that something probably is wrong.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah.
I think generally what really happens in those scenarios is not that things shoot off to infinity; it's that things get really weird, right? There's when you're dealing with complex systems, fractals and stuff just naturally emerge from the math. There was, a couple months ago or so, there was like some paper that came out where someone found that like there's this fractal structure with like the decision boundary in neural networks or something. And a bunch of people on Twitter were like, "Oh wow, isn't this so surprising?" And I read it and I'm like, I could have told everyone this months ago. Like this is just something that falls out of the math very obviously if you look at it from the right perspective. Um, but like, it, one thing that's very closely related to a lot of those types of systems in math would be stuff like I would be there's like the Feigenbaum constants, and I think it's the logistic map. Let me just double check. Um, yeah, the logistic map, and the interesting thing about this, you know, it's this piece of math that just emerges from a very, very large number of chaotic systems, and I think it's actually in some respects like this kind of universal chaotic system where there's some sense in which every chaotic system has this underlying it. And one thing that you see in it is like it has like this kind of this structure that looks like it's kind of it like it has this shape where it like it's this curve, this line, and then it like bifurcates into two, and then each one of those bifurcates into two, and it grows exponentially, and then it kind of converges onto this point where it seems to hit like this infinite. The rate at which it's expanding should become infinite, and it's like this is like the singularity point, and then the graph continues after that, and what happens there is it just becomes extremely chaotic, right? You don't have like some kind of blow up to infinity, you just get chaos,
Hmm.
right? You just get something where it becomes a lot harder to predict what's going to happen.
Yes. So I guess the gist of this is that there are principles in physics and principles in math and
Mhm,
complexity theory that if we know
mhm,
that we're sticking to, and we are mindful of, we shouldn't be
mhm.
getting anything too strange and too
Yeah, or
too
at the very
out
least,
of out of the
yeah,
ordinary in terms of our
yeah, or
expectations.
at the very least, you can find some good indicators that actually this kind of thing is probably not very plausible. We've
Right.
probably actually made a mistake somewhere.
Yeah.
Um,
So I wanted to sort of, I guess we've talked a little bit about technology and how we understand what kind of like uh realistic constraints we're under, in a very like hard science way. But another angle on this, as far as like world building and narrative construction, is is cultural innovation, right? I would imagine that in any kind of futuristic sci-fi scenario, um, there's going to be cultural and social innovation that has to do with the possibility space of tech that these technologies have opened up. So I just wanted to ask, um, briefly, like what kind of focus there is um, on like cultural changes. Ollie, you mentioned previously the problem of childbearing on other planets, right, with different gravitational fields. That's like one small thing, but I could imagine that there are a lot of other cultural reconfigurations, and social changes that could be adopted. Has that been a big theme in the works that you guys are working on?
It definitely has, and so we do in fact consider social technology to be a like valid technology type.
Very
I mean,
important one.
very, very, very important. Um, which is why we obviously don't exclusively publish hard sci-fi. In fact, let's see.
We do
Sorry, I'm
have a
trying to figure
story,
out.
coming out on Friday that does touch on,
It's
like, social
exactly
cultural progress a bit. Um,
yeah.
it's a story that we are very excited about, so,
Yes.
um
Yeah. It's like there is. So one thing that I have been thinking about, especially since we're publishing this particular story on Friday, but is like how does art and how do art movements change in the future? Where for a while, and I don't know. So this has been my take on it, and recently I found out that it was someone else's take as well, which was cool because I haven't spoken about it that much. But for like the past 5, 7 years or so, I've like felt this stagnation in the arts area. And then very recently, AI image generation. The artists will like murder me if I call it AI art. Um, AI image generation has come in and like maybe threatened the careers of lots and lots of people. But the effect that I one effect that I see it having is that it's causing the people who are like very, very dedicated to art in itself to like compete directly with it. It's causing them to like skill up really hard. It's causing them to um, come back with more fire. And so I think that just the example of AI image generation and its recent effects on the arts industries, and I'm like they're totally going to be so mad at me for saying this because I'm like, look at this good thing that has come of this thing that you're all very threatened by. But I've seen people learn from it and skill up in response to it. And if you, yeah, I wonder what that will do over the next 5 to 7 years for the arts, and whether there will be a continued growth in that pattern. So that's one area that falls within social technology that at least I've been thinking about in regards to how we can view the progress that has already been made and that will continue to be made in this area. How we can view it in like through an optimistic lens.
Mhm. I think the storytelling in general is a social technology. It
Oh yeah.
is it is in some sense, it's conveying, and communicating ideas about just how the world works, right? Okay, this person is in this situation and this happens, right? But it's also conveying, ideas about how people should respond in situations of like, okay, this person's in this situation, they decide to do this, and this is the result, right? And sometimes that result is good and sometimes it's bad. And sometimes you have cautionary tales, and sometimes you have things that are a bit um more prescriptive. And we are trying to focus with our stories in the magazine on more of a more kind of more personal stories,
Mhm.
and more about like the human condition. You can tell stories that are about like these about like very large scale trends in the world or something, but the problem is like that's not very actionable for people, right? I think part of what's going on in the world right now is there's a large number of things that are changing, and I think a lot of people just feel lost and they're looking for what do I do to navigate this new world that we're all entering. And I think if you just try to tell stories about like here's some like giant war or something that's going on, and something that's like very very high level, very far apart from like people's day-to-day experience, you're not actually helping people navigate that very well, right? Whereas I think if you are kind of exploring ideas about like, okay, here's some new technology, how does it affect your day-to-day life, I think that has a much much larger positive impact on the people who are going to be reading that and thinking about what do I how do I understand the future? How do I navigate it? I think we've been Ollie and I have been viewing sci-fi as kind of a as like mythology for the industrial age, right? And there are many many ideas in mythology that are there are many kind of things in like the mythological toolbox of like how people have been telling stories for thousands of years that I think line up very well with what role sci-fi at least is capable of playing and has played at various times in the past. You do have like sometimes you have speculative technologies that are here's something that might actually exist in the future, and sometimes you have a speculative technology that's more of like here is something that maybe is not actually that realistic, but it's like it lets you explore a very specific like philosophical idea more directly, right? And
Mhm.
that's something that has that's something that isn't just like philosophy for 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 thinking about the future, but also is like practical with like day to day life. There's for thousands, you can go back to ancient times and you can read stuff like the ancient Greek story of like the ring of Gyges, right?
Right.
It's like, okay, you have this like magical ring that makes you invisible. What do people do with it? And the guy in the story murders the king and sleeps with the queen, and it's supposed to be kind of a way of exploring what do people do without accountability, right? And there are interesting questions that you can ask around there. I think one interesting kind of magical technology that historically has shown up in some stories that is perhaps a little bit more relevant today would be stuff like magic lamps, where or kind of the adjacent thing of like the monkey's paw, of like you make a wish, but like your wish is kind of underspecified and you get something that's like very horribly wrong. And I think this is very closely related to what a lot of people are seeing with AI.
Yeah, it's
Of
sort of everyone's experience with LLMs, right?
Yeah, yeah. I had
Yeah.
some tweet the other day, and I've made this joke plenty of times before, but it's like, the original prompt engineering is like the magic lamp,
Yeah.
or like the monkey's paw of like, you or like, people have, you know like the people in programming languages, working on programming languages and software, those kinds of software tools, um, I think there's a huge amount of room for like better software development tooling.
Yeah.
But I think it's and better ideas around how do we engineer systems
Mhm.
in this way. But I think a lot of the ideas that are getting that have been tossed around for the past few decades, I think are kind of going down the wrong, or not a particularly interesting path. But I think, one or not the best path at least, right? It's kind of a suboptimal path. It
Yeah.
might be interesting, but it's not exactly that. It's not as useful as some of the alternatives could be, right? Like I would love to have like better, like the debugging tools that we should have should make Minority Report look like the Stone Age. We should not be using GDB from like the 80s, right? Um, and but like there's a lot of you have stuff with people doing like functional programming and a lot of these like ideas about like higher level programming where kind of the observation is like that you can have like more programming language features and stuff that make software like more compressible, and you can do a lot more with like a lot less code. And
Mhm.
oftentimes what that is you're specifying, people are trying to move in the direction of like you are specifying what your program does and not how you do it, right? And the
Yeah.
problem is if you're not specifying how you do it, the
Mhm.
consequence of that usually is like, okay, the computer gets the job done, but it's like orders of magnitude less efficient than it should be, right? Okay, the computer does the task, but it like takes 10 times, 100 times longer than it should have taken.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well, the problem is like
Mhm.
it, everything becomes about like increasing levels of abstraction,
Yeah,
and it turns out that like it's very hard to actually do that in a fine grained way that's not
yeah.
cutting corners.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah,
You're under specifying the solution, right?
right.
The genie's lamp, the monkey's paw thing is like, okay, I wish for $1 million, and then the way that you get your $1 million is like some like beloved family member gets killed in some horrible way, and now you get
Yeah,
life insurance, right? Okay, you got what you asked for, but you underspecified how you got there, and so now you wound up with a completely different result, right?
right. And so
Um,
those are
so
interesting starting off points for like exploring like
mhm,
the philosophical implications of like different problems, right? Like the
mhm,
specification problem just as a general problem
mhm,
for
yeah.
how you
I think
interact with any technology.
yeah, and there's also like the story of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is I think surprisingly similar to well, I think it's been influential on some of the people making arguments about like paperclip maximizers. But
Mhm.
like that is also something where this is like an older story that's been around for a few centuries, and it's relevant to modern discussions about AI.
Well,
Um,
the cool thing is like you can revive these
yeah.
story structures, right, as
Mhm,
archetypes, and
mhm,
Yeah.
they still resonate to people even with
mhm,
new in new outfits, basically.
mhm. I
So
think I've tossed around the idea before of like maybe something that's a or maybe kind of like a modern retelling of the Picture of Dorian Gray, but it's
yeah,
like some like young girl with like image filters or something might be an interesting story to tell.
or
Doing that in optimistic ways, maybe.
your metaverse avatar could
Yeah,
Oh,
be.
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So I wanted to there's a few more things I want to cover. I wanted to touch a little bit on aesthetics, and really what I'm getting at here is like what are the uh, influences as far as the aesthetics for the magazine and the aesthetics that you're trying to present, in conjunction with these stories.
So for each story, Charles mentioned that each story comes along with a nonfiction companion piece. And then in addition to that, we have an illustrator or artist. In some future cases, we might have photographers, for example, um, create visual works that go along with each story. And so far, I think I think we have a different artist for every one of our stories that we've like finished so far, not just that we've published, but that we finished. And correct me if I'm wrong, Charles. But one of the things, or like one of the, I think aesthetic is another area where we want to build out this really vast landscape of possible positive visions of the future. And for some people, that's how they express that. So for each story, we kind of discuss with the author what art style they're visualizing this in. We find an artist who's really excited about it, and so far, all of the artists have been like really excited about the stories that they've worked with. And we pair them up and have them discuss what to illustrate from each story. And then for the overall magazine aesthetic, right now we just publish on Substack. We are wanting to publish and fingers crossed by the end of the year, we're really working on it, publish a physical magazine.
Mm.
One of the things that we're working on right now that has been a little bit on hold since we started actively publishing weekly on Substack has been figuring out the aesthetic for the magazine, because we can show off different art styles by different artists, but you need something to frame it that stays the same, that stays consistent. And I do branding consulting work, so
Mm.
I'm like very much into this. You have to have something that is the Possibilia brand, and that's something that we're working on building out right now. We've thrown around a few fun ideas. Like one idea that Charles had that I would really like to pursue, that I think we all would really like to pursue, is to have an artists retreat where we take like five or so artists that we who we think are very future focused, future oriented, and are trying to build out their own unique perspective and aesthetic on the future. And the Possibilia team and these artists, and maybe a few people who work in science and technology as well, like go somewhere very very cool and probably pretty remote for at least 2 or 3 days. Like probably more like 5 would be ideal. And we together develop the aesthetic of the print magazine, and this would be the aesthetic that we end up taking on as our brand, and that we would use when we eventually move from Substack to our own online platform.
I think at the very least, a lot of visions of the future, and a lot of like sci-fi genres, in many cases have kind of an aesthetic that corresponds to it, right? Like
Yeah.
you can recognize cyberpunk fairly
Yeah.
Mm.
easily, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I think I think there is a very strong visual aspect to this, and I think there is a lot of need to not only come up with ideas about what the future, but a future looks like, but to also like associate those ideas with a unique art style, right? I think
Yep.
we're kind of stuck in a box, and we need something to break us out of that box.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that is interesting that you have this problem of needing to develop like the alternative
Mhm,
to the previous, you know, futuristic sci-fi aesthetics,
mhm,
whatever those
And
might have been.
it's really challenging. And so one of the things that I do on the side, I do a lot of creative stuff, some consulting, mostly in like arts and creative industries, but for science and tech. So one of the things that I'm working on right now, um, I have limited clearance on what I can talk about on this, but I can say that I am developing a new style of architecture for an international architectural project. And by developing a new style, I mean like it it has to be it has to be iconic, it has to be beautiful, it has to be very distinct from anything that is coming out of like the futurist architecture movement now that is happening, that started with, for example, Zaha Hadid. I can say also that, and this might be exciting, that we're calling it classical futurism.
Oh, that's sick.
mhm.
And I've been working on it for 2 years, and it's still not there. It's
Mm.
still not there. It's so hard to create a new aesthetic, because you want to not be too reactive to the previous thing. Because if you're too reactive to the previous thing, then you're blocking out, like, you're blocking a lot of potential and a lot of possibility and a lot of reality, honestly, out of your attention that's not going to get into your work. And then it also can't ignore the current social context because it has to inspire people, it has to relate to people, it has to be understood by people. Like design and art, um, architecture, music, all of this is it's a method of not only expression. I think when people say that art is for expression, they got it half right. It's a method of communication.
Mhm.
And I think communication is going to be that type of communication, I think is going to be key to visualizing a positive future.
That's very cool.
Sorry,
Um,
I'll I'll get down off my soapbox.
no, I liked it. I like the new architectural style that's coming in. I mean, that's what I'm looking for when I'm asking about aesthetics, right? Like
Mhm.
this hybrid approach, and I think the real issue you have is, yeah, like you said, you can't be too divergent from the past because then there's no continuity, but you also
Yeah.
don't want to seem retro, like you're just doing a callback.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Um,
it's very hard to not being derivative
mm,
is almost impossible. Like they say, there's nothing new under the sun, etc. But so that's why. Oh, one last point on aesthetics. Um, I try to start with the philosophy and then translate it into an aesthetic. Usually,
mm, okay, that's interesting to think about. I think I think the stereotypical understanding of the artist is that they're sort of like very perceptive, and what they end up creating as far as an aesthetic is a projection of their perception. But you're talking about sort of framing your perception almost in like philosophical terms, and then seeing what comes out of that.
right, right.
Hmm. So you guys are obviously like pretty ambitious with what you're trying to do. I think it's a laudable project and something that's worthwhile. I'm surprised that this kind of hole in the space. I don't know if I would call it a market. I mean, there is a market, but I don't feel like that's the right word. It's more like a cultural gap. Um, is not filled already. And one of the things I wanted to ask about, like in undertaking this project, and you're both working on this now. You've been doing it for quite some time. The magazine is out. You're talking about getting a physical print copy here in the near future. What have been like some of the challenges for you as a team in getting this going?
Um, a lot of the so I do, and we do have a third team member, Andres. He's our head of design. He's also working on a marketing campaign for us right now as well. Um, I think that one of the challenges that we're facing is that we have a like pretty balanced team. We're all very ambitious, and I think the one key thing that we're lacking is something like organization. Um, we I think when you have a lot of ambitious people who are generating very cool ideas and really enjoy that, a lot of their energy goes into that. And so it becomes harder to like do things like coordinate very, very smoothly on logistical tasks.
Mm,
So that's been at least from my experience, that's been a challenge that we've had. Also, none of us really have, I say really, none of us at all have experience in publication. So that has been, there's a definite learning curve there. I think we recently put a system in place that like nails it for us. So that's very exciting. Um, and then I'm sure there are others. These are coming from a very like production perspective, and then I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were going for. But Charles, I'm sure you've got some to add here as well.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think there are, there's just a lot of hard things that we're trying to do,
Yeah.
and part
yeah.
of I think part of it is just like this is a hard problem, and maybe people are a little discouraged about how to do it. Maybe people don't quite know how to do it. Um, like
Oh,
there aren't too I don't think there's too many like easy playbooks out there of like here's how to solve this type of problem. Um, and so we have kind of just been trying to figure out a lot of things ourselves. And so
we're also at a weird intersection. So we're at the intersection of art and tech, and
mhm.
the tech people don't want to fund art, and the art people don't want to fund tech. And so,
Mhm.
like, no one wants to fund us ever. And we're like, fine, whatever, guys. We have we have successfully raised some funding, but like, and then that it's not just on the funding level; it's also on like the social level, where there's this weird flip that happens where all of the tech people are like, yes, finally, and all of the art people are like, yes, finally, and then they'll say that once, and we never hear from them again, or something. Um, but our the people who have showed like very I guess constant or consistent support in the project have been very very passionate about following it and reading the stories and like talking checking in with us um and that type of thing. So that's cool. But yeah, being at the intersection of art and tech is just it's a really weird place to be, and it's almost like a the tides could turn against us on either side at any second type thing, but we are in fact trying to unify them in a way that is productive and positive for everyone involved. But
I think
sorry.
there are people who are kind of there are we're not the only people who are at least pointing out that there needs to be more work done with art and tech.
Yeah.
But I think it just hasn't it hasn't really turned that talk hasn't really turned into much yet, other
Yes.
than what we're doing, and there's, like, a couple of other small things that I've seen. Like, there's I've talked to some of the people behind, like, Blimp DAO, for example, and,
Yeah.
like, that's that's definitely more of an art movement than it is tech, but it's a little bit tech adjacent, kind of.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that hopefully the upshot of this will be that you'll get some really committed
Mhm.
people, involved in it, and that will be enough to sort of continue carrying it forward and growing out from like a very solid critical mass.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
would
Yeah.
be, I guess, the ideal scenario. And then maybe, I kind of, I'll just say this as someone in tech, like I think tech maybe 30 years ago was like very contrarian and very individualistic. And I actually think that a lot of tech now is kind of full of like bandwagoners.
Mhm.
There's
Mm.
not
Absolutely,
a lot of
absolutely.
like first
Mm.
movers
Mhm.
around these days because of the popularity and the lucrativeness of tech. Um, and
Right.
so it might just be where the industry's at right now. Um, but who knows? So what is coming next for Possibilia? What can people expect to see in the future, so far as you can talk about it?
Well, as we mentioned, we're publishing a story this Friday. The companion piece for that comes out the Friday after. Oh, we didn't mention another thing that we are working on as the three of us, the current core Possibilia team, is we're creating these vignettes. They're like mini like micro stories or mini pieces.
Hmm.
And those are created by our team.
Yeah.
So those are us um, expressing our positive visions for the future.
Mhm.
Um,
And that's also, we've kind of been viewing it as like, we're leaning a little bit more onto kind of visual storytelling, or doing other things that because this is a bit of a visual medium with the online publication and eventually the print magazine. That is a very visual medium, and so okay, what can you do with that? Well, you can do more than just text, right? Um, and so it's certainly been, we've certainly had some. we've been trying to play around with that a bit. The first vignette that we published was called Tape Deck Britannica, and it was an ad for it's this ad from the future, basically, of like, what do you do if you're in space and light lag means that the internet is just impractical to use? Well, what you do is you resort to like a modern version of this old technology of like encyclopedias. And so instead of having Encyclopedia Britannica, you have Tape Deck Britannica, and it's just like you have 100 petabytes of tape drives on your spaceship, and you just have this enormous amount of data that you can spend your time digging through instead of if using the internet is too inconvenient, right? Um, and so, we're doing some things that are kind of viewed as we're kind of thinking about some of these as like artifacts from the future, right?
Mhm.
So, maybe you have an ad, maybe you have, the last couple that we did were kind of a journal from the future. What other kinds of things can we do? We've also talked about doing some sponsored content with different startups. We want to prioritize hard tech, I guess. Atoms over bits, or if people are doing stuff with bits, are doing stuff with software. I want to prioritize stuff that's actually like very different.
Mm.
And unfortunately I don't see a whole lot of that, but uh, I'd certainly like to kind of push for more interesting stuff in computing, where the next century of computing is not just an extrapolation of the last century of computing, that it actually goes in an interesting direction, and we find some new unique things to be doing with computers, right? um the I think there's a lot of people who just brief tangent on this, like, I think people will point to how much benefit comes out of advancing computer hardware, and as someone with like a chip startup, like, yeah, that's certainly there. But I think also, like, the space of possible things that you can do with like 32 bytes of memory is more than there are more possible things that you can do with 32 bytes of memory than there are atoms in the universe, right? If Moore's law had ended decades ago, we'd still be able to innovate on software until the end of time and still not have made the tiniest dent in it, right? Um, I think the stuff that can be done in that space is just vastly more unusual and strange and bizarre and interesting than what people have imagined so far, right? And I would kind of like to push people in a direction where, like, there is more innovation, or more reason to be innovative. And I think as Moore's law ends, and as like computing power starts to plateau, I think that is going to actually there is going to be a need for that. And so at the very least, and so you can wait for that to happen on its own, or you can provide people with, here's a bunch of new ideas to kind of get you started, right? And that's where I'd like to have some kind of influence of, like, we are enter the world is changing in a lot of different ways. We have the internet, we have compute we've had computing for a few decades, and it's going to be like hitting a there's it's going to be like make taking a phase transition soon, I think. And I think there's we're gonna have space technology, and we're gonna have a lot of other very interesting things going on the next few decades. And I think laying out, here are some very interesting ideas that are very different from what people have historically heard around this. But like laying out, here are some like new interesting ideas that you haven't heard before to get you started in like figuring out what you want to build. Um, I think would be very, very valuable. And we certainly don't want to and we do want to keep things optimistic, because I think people do look to sci-fi for ideas. There is that like classic tweet of like about the torment nexus, right?
Oh,
You know
yeah.
Mm.
the um of like the sci-fi author says, like, I wrote this story about the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. And then then the tech company announces, we've built the torment nexus from the classic sci-fi story, don't build the torment nexus.
Right, right.
This is of course like a dig at the metaverse, right? The
Yeah.
metaverse is supposed to be this dystopian cautionary tale about the future, and then now Facebook renames their company to Meta and announces that they're building the metaverse, right? And dumps $40 billion into it, and it doesn't really it's not going nearly as well as they expected, but I think also, like, I think VR is a particular VR and AR are a particularly s are a particularly interesting technology in that people have been pushing it for a decade or so, at least with, like, this current wave of AI or with this current wave of VR, and it hasn't caught on yet, and people are blaming the hardware, but actually, I think, if the benefits outweigh the costs, people will switch, right? And I think what is going on there is like, if there was a killer app for VR, it doesn't matter how good or bad the technology is, this would have been adopted a long time ago, right? I think a big thing that we're missing with VR and AR is like we don't have a Doug Engelbart for VR, right? We don't have someone who like Doug Engelbart had his like 1968 I think demo that he gave about like graphical user interfaces and stuff, and it's very frequently called the mother of all demos because
Mhm.
it's just like this one like short demo, an hour or two long, just like demonstrates it's like, oh hey, we have like text editing, we have cut copy and paste, we have drop down menus, we have like video calls, and we have all of these other technologies, just like showing off like, hey, this is actually like practical to do today in the 60s. And like a very very large amount of modern software is all just directly downstream from like this one talk that was given in the 60s, right? And by Doug Engelbart, and we don't have any like visionary people to imagine like what is the future of like this type of technology look like. What How do we take this like very interesting technology about like the future of like this very new interface of for computing that works very differently from what we're used to, and imagine what is the next what are the things that we can do with this that we can't do with other things. And there are ideas in that space, but like the ideas that are new are like very dystopian, and I think the general public outside of if you talk to people outside of tech, you generally get there is a lot of pessimism about like, do we really like, is AI, is VR really something that we actually want? Like I've definitely talked to people outside of tech who do not have who are very cautious about the future of VR. And I think you need fresh ideas that are optimistic and really thinking outside the box of like what can we do with this, and also thinking about like there are also deeper things of it's not just like some you're not just like coming up with like some kind of like lorem ipsum ideas of like this is just like a bunch of random stuff to kind of fill up space of like here's just like a bunch of things you can do with VR, but it's like, okay, what are the actually like valuable things that you can do with this technology, right?
Yeah.
um
Can I add
Um,
something real quick?
Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
So sorry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So we are working on some partnerships, also seeking additional partners, like Charles said, very, very interested, especially in hard tech, atoms over bits.
Mhm.
Um, we can currently announce our newly formed partnership with the Tadpole experiment. That's the pop-up experiment on magnetic fields. They're testing the Earth's magnetic field as well as Mars, and will be it's very quick shout out to them, and then I'll wrap it up. But they are doing the entire experience or experiment in what they call open science mode. So they're publishing all of their data every day, live updates.
Mhm.
They're going to be streaming the experiment live on Twitch, um, releasing YouTube videos. We're working with dry AI to like create their own Reddit platform on their website with them, and also an interactive data platform. It's really cool. I'm working with them right now on uh, a story on this. So you can look forward to that over the summer. Other than that, let's see, we are aiming to have our print issue out this year as well, our first print issue. Ideally, that will become a quarterly occurrence. And then we also want to have an event by the end of the year. Um, so, event invites, we haven't figured out exactly how to do that yet. I imagine that at some point we'll have like a ticket sale kind of thing. And then as for location, I would really like to have it at the abandoned movie theater at the center of Celebration, Florida, where I live. Um, Working on figuring out how to get into the theater, but it's this really amazing, big, like Art Deco retro future theater. So possibly very cool event there happening this year. At some point, we are going to publish our like the editors are going to publish our bounty board for stories.
Mm,
So look out for that. We would like to have the artist retreat this year as well, and then we want to have some kind of writing contest. um, Things have been a bit too hectic for us to plan anything super concrete, but it would be great to do one of those this year as well. So those are things that are coming up that folks can look forward to. And then as well, in addition to that, just weekly publishing. We publish every Friday. We try to publish by 6 p.m. Sometimes it's 7.
mm. Wow. Well, that's a lot to look forward to.
Mhm,
I mean, one of the nice things about encountering this team is like you guys are so generative, and
mhm,
I understand what you're talking about, how hard it is to get all these ideas organized.
Oh
mhm.
yeah.
Um, Great. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for doing this. For those of you who are interested in Possibilia, in supporting Possibilia as a subscriber or being a part of the magazine as either a writer or a sponsor or some other kind of contributor, um, you can go download the future at possibiliamag.com. That's right.
That's right.
All right. Well, Charles, Ollie, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a
Well, thank
pleasure.
you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for
Mhm.
having us. It's been great chatting.